The Peshitta is the standard version of the Bible for churches in the Syriac tradition. The general, but not universal, consensus among Bible scholars is that the Old Testament of the Peshitta was translated into Syriac from the Hebrew, probably in the 2nd century AD, and that the New Testament of the Peshitta was translated from the Greek. This New Testament, originally excluding certain disputed books, had become a standard by the early 5th century. The 5 excluded books were added in the Harkleyan version of Thomas of Harkle. However, the 1905 United Bible Society Peshitta used new editions prepared by the Irish Syriacist John Gwynn for the missing books. Etymology. The name Peshitta is derived from the Syriac mapakta sitta, literally meaning simple version. However, it is also possible to translate sitta as common or straight, as well as the usual translation as simple. Syriac is a dialect, or group of dialects, of Eastern Aramaic, originating in northern Mesopotamia and around Edessa. It is written in the Syriac alphabet, and is transliterated into the Latin script in a number of ways. Peshitta, 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 Sitta, Peshito, Shito. All of these are acceptable, but Peshitta is the most conventional spelling in English. History of the Syriac versions. Analogy of Latin Vulgate. There is no full and clear knowledge of the circumstances under which the Peshitta was produced and came into circulation, whereas the authorship of the Latin Vulgate has never been in dispute. Almost every assertion regarding the authorship of the Peshitta and its time and place of its origin is subject to question. The chief ground of analogy between the Vulgate and the Peshitta is that both came into existence as the result of a revision. This, indeed, has been strenuously denied, but since Drive Hort in his introduction to Westcott and Hort's New Testament in the original Greek, following Griesbach and Hug at the beginning of the 19th century, maintained this view, it has gained many adherents. As far as the Gospels and other New Testament books are concerned, there is evidence in favor of this view, which has been added to by recent discoveries, and fresh investigation in the field of Syriac scholarship has raised it to a high degree of probability. The very designation, Peshitta, has given rise to dispute. It has been applied to the Syriac as the version in common use, and regarded as equivalent to the Greek Koine and the Latin Vulgate. The designation, Peshitta, the word itself is a feminine form, meaning simple, as in, easy to be understood. It seems to have been used to distinguish the version from others which are encumbered with marks and signs in the nature of a critical apparatus. However, the term as a designation of the version has not been found in any Syriac author earlier than the 9th or 10th century. As regards the Old Testament, the antiquity of the version is admitted on all hands. The tradition, however, that part of it was translated from Hebrew into Syriac for the benefit of Hiram in the days of Solomon is surely a myth. That a translation was made by a priest named Asa, or Ezra, whom the king of Assyria sent to Samaria, to instruct the Assyrian colonists mentioned in 2 Kings chapter 17, is equally legendary. That the translation of the Old Testament and New Testament was made in connection with the visitor Thaddeus to Abgar at Edessa belongs also to unreliable tradition. Mark has even been credited in ancient Syriac tradition with translating his own Gospel and the other books of the New Testament into Syriac. Syriac Old Testament. But what Theodore of Mopsuestia says of the Old Testament is true of both. These scriptures were translated into the tongue of the Syriacs by someone indeed at some time, but who on earth this was has not been made known down to our day. F. Crawford Burkitt concluded that the translation of the Old Testament was probably the work of Jews, of whom there was a colony in Edessa about the commencement of the Christian era. The older view was that the translators were Christians, and that the work was done late in the 1st century or early in the 2nd. The Old Testament known to the early Syrian Church was substantially that of the Palestinian Jews. It contained the same number of books, but it arranged them in a different order. First there was the Pentateuch, then Job, Joshua, Judges, 1 and 2 Samuel, 1 and 2 Kings, 1 and 2 Chronicles, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Ruth, the Song of Songs, Esther, Ezra, Nehemiah, Isaiah, followed by the 12 minor prophets, Jeremiah and Lamentations, Ezekiel, and Daniel. Most of the apocryphal books of the Old Testament are found in the Syriac, and the Wisdom of Sirach is held to have been translated from the Hebrew and not from the Septuagint. Syriac New Testament. Of the New Testament, attempts at translation must have been made very early, and among the ancient versions of New Testament scripture, the Syriac, in all likelihood, is the earliest. It was at Antioch, the capital of Syria, that the disciples of Christ were first called Christians, and it seemed natural that the first translation of the Christian scriptures should have been made there. The tendency of recent research, however, goes to show that Edessa, the literary capital, was more likely the place. If we could accept the somewhat obscure statement of Eusebius that Hegesippus made some quotations from the Gospel according to the Hebrews and from the Syriac Gospel, we should have a reference to a Syriac New Testament as early as 160–180 AD, the time of that Hebrew Christian writer. One thing is certain, that the earliest New Testament of the Syriac Church lacked not only the Anti-Legomena to Peter, 2 and 3 John, Jude, and the Apocalypse, but the whole of the Catholic epistles. These were at a later date translated and received into the Syriac canon of the New Testament. But the quotations of the early Syrian fathers take no notice of these New Testament books. From the 5th century, however, the Peshitta containing both the Old Testament and New Testament has been used in its present form only as the national version of the Syriac scriptures. The translation of the New Testament is careful, faithful and literal, and the simplicity, directness and transparency of the style are admired by all Syriac scholars and have earned for it the title of Queen of the Versions, Old Syriac texts. It is in the Gospels, however, that the analogy between the Latin Vulgate and the Syriac Vulgate can be established by evidence. If the Peshitta is the result of a revision as the Vulgate was, then we may expect to find Old Syriac texts answering to the Old Latin. Such texts have actually been found. 3 such texts have been recovered, all showing divergences from the Peshitta, and believed by competent scholars to be anterior to it. These are, to take them in the order of their recovery in modern times, the Curetonian Syriac, the Syriac of Tatian's Diates Aaron, and the Sinaitic Syriac. Details on Curetonian. The Curetonian consists of fragments of the Gospels brought in 1842 from the Nitrian Desert in Egypt and now in the British Museum. The fragments were examined by Canon Cureton of Westminster and edited by him in 1858. The manuscript from which the fragments have come appears to belong to the 5th century, but scholars believe the text itself to be as old as the 100s AD. In this recension, the Gospel according to Matthew has the title Evangelion Dharma Pharesha, which will be explained in the next section. Details on Tatian's Diates Aaron. The Diates Aaron is the work which Eusebius ascribes to Tatian, an early Christian author considered by some to have been a heretic. Eusebius called it that combination and collection of the Gospels, I know not how, to which he gave the title Diates Aaron. It is the earliest harmony of the 4 Gospels known to us. Its existence is amply attested in the churches of Mesopotamia and Syria, but it had disappeared for centuries, and not a single copy of the Syriac work survives. A commentary upon it by Ephraim the Syrian, surviving in an Armenian translation, was issued by the Mekhitarist Fathers at Venice in 1836, and afterward translated into Latin. Since 1876, an Arabic translation of the Diates Aaron itself has been discovered, and it has been ascertained that the cod Fuldensis of the Vulgate represents the order and contents of the Diates Aaron. A translation from the Arabic can now be read in English in Dr. J. Hamland Hill's The Earliest Life of Christ Ever Compiled from the Four Gospels. Although no copy of the Diates Aaron has survived, the general features of Tatian's Syriac work can be gathered from these materials. It is still a matter of dispute whether Tatian composed his harmony out of a Syriac version already made, or composed it first in Greek and then translated it into Syriac. But the existence and widespread use of a harmony, combining in one all four Gospels, from such an early period, enables us to understand the title Evangelion Dharma Pharesha. It means the Gospel of the Separated, and points to the existence of single Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, in Syriac, in contradistinction to Tatian's harmony. Theodort, Bishop of Cyrrhus in the 5th century, tells how he found more than 200 copies of the Diates Aaron held in honor in his diocese, and how he collected them, and put them out of the way, associated as they were with the name of a heretic, and substituted for them the Gospels of the four evangelists in their separate forms. Sinaitic Syriac. In 1892, the discovery of the third text, known, from the place where it was found, as the Sinaitic Syriac, comprising the four Gospels nearly entire, heightened the interest in the subject and increased the available material. It is a palimpsest, and was found in the monastery of Catherine on Mount Sinai by Mrs. Agnes S. Lewis and her sister Mrs. Margaret D. Gibson. The text has been carefully examined, and many scholars regard it as representing the earliest translation into Syriac, and reaching back into the 2nd century. Like the Curetonian, it is an example of the Evangelion Dharma Pharesha as distinguished from the harmony of Tatian. Relation to Peshitta. The discovery of these texts has raised many questions which it may require further discovery and further investigation to answer satisfactorily. It is natural to ask, what is the relation of these three texts to the Peshitta? There are still scholars, foremost of whom is G. H. Gwilliam, the learned editor of the Oxford Peshitta, who maintain the priority of the Peshitta and insist upon its claim to be the earliest monument of Syrian Christianity. But the progress of investigation into Syriac Christian literature points distinctly the other way. From an exhaustive study of the quotations in the earliest Syriac fathers, and, in particular, of the works of Ephraim Syrris, Professor Burkitt concludes that the Peshitta did not exist in the 4th century. He finds that Ephraim used the Diates Aaron in the main as the source of his quotation, although his voluminous writings contain some clear indications that he was aware of the existence of the separate Gospels, and he seems occasionally to have quoted from them. Such quotations as are found in other extant remains of Syriac literature before the 5th century bear a greater resemblance to the readings of the Curetonian and the Sinaitic than to the readings of the Peshitta. Internal and external evidence alike point to the later and revised character of the Peshitta. Brief history of the Peshitta. The Peshitta had from the 5th century onward a wide circulation in the East, and was accepted and honored by all the numerous sects of the greatly divided Syriac Christianity. It had a great missionary influence, and the Armenian and Georgian versions, as well as the Arabic and the Persian, owe not a little to the Syriac. The famous Nestorian tablet of Sing and Fu witnesses to the presence of the Syriac scriptures in the heart of China in the 7th century. It was first brought to the West by Moses of Mydin, a noted Syrian ecclesiastic, who sought a patron for the work of printing it in vain in Rome and Venice, but found one in the imperial chancellor at Vienna in 1555, Albert Widmanstadt. He undertook the printing of the New Testament, and the emperor bore the cost of the special types which had to be cast for its issue in Syriac. Emmanuel Tremulius, the converted Jew whose scholarship was so valuable to the English reformers and divines, made use of it, and in 1569 issued a Syriac New Testament in Hebrew letters. In 1645 the Editio Princeps of the Old Testament was prepared by Gabriel Schneider for the Paris polyglot, and in 1657 the whole Peshitta found a place in Walton's London Polyglot. For long the best edition of the Peshitta was that of John Lounsden and Carl Scharf, and it is still quoted under the symbol Scharf, or Seish. The critical edition of the Gospels recently issued by Mr. G.H. Gwilliam at the Clarendon Press is based upon some 50 manuscripts. Considering the revival of Syriac scholarship, and the large company of workers engaged in this field, we may expect further contributions of a similar character to a new and complete critical edition of the Peshitta. Old Testament Peshitta. The Peshitta version of the Old Testament is an independent translation based largely on a Hebrew text similar to the Proto-Masoretic text. It shows a number of linguistic and exegetical similarities to the Targumim but is now no longer thought to derive from them. In some passages the translators have clearly used the Greek Septuagint. The influence of the Septuagint is particularly strong in Isaiah and the Psalms, probably due to their use in the liturgy. Most of the Deuterocanonicals are translated from the Septuagint, and the translation of Sirach was based on a Hebrew text. The choice of books included in the Old Testament Peshitta changes from one manuscript to another. Usually most of the Deuterocanonicals are present. Other biblical apocryphae, as 1 Esdras, 3 Maccabees, 4 Maccabees, Psalm chapter 151 can be found in some manuscripts. The manuscript of Bibliotheca Ambrosiana, discovered in 1866, includes also 2 Baruch named manuscripts. More than 250 manuscripts of the Old Testament Peshitta are known, and the main and older ones are London, British Library, Ad. 14,425, dated in the second half of 5th century. It includes only Genesis, Exodus, Numbers and Deuteronomy. The text is more similar to the Masoretic text than the text of most other manuscripts, even if somewhere it has relevant differences. Milan, Bibliotheca Ambrosiana. 21 INF Codex Ambrosianus. It was discovered by Antonio Siriani in 1866 and published in 1876 to 1883. This manuscript dates from the 6th or the 7th century. In 1006 it became part of the library of the Syrian monastery in Egypt and in the 17th century was moved to Milan. The text is used as base text in the critical edition of Peshitta Institute of Leiden. It includes all the books of the Hebrew Bible and Wisdom, Letter of Jeremiah, Baruch, Bel and the Dragon, Susanna, Judith, Sirach, 1 Maccabees, 2 Maccabees, 3 Maccabees, 4 Maccabees, 2 Baruch with the letter of Baruch, 2 Esdras, and the second book of the Jewish War. Paris, Bibliothèque Nationale, Cyr. 341. It dates from the 8th century or even before and has many corrections. It includes all the books of the Hebrew Bible and Wisdom, Letter of Jeremiah, Baruch, Bel and the Dragon, Susanna, Judith, Sirach, 1 Maccabees, 2 Maccabees, 3 Maccabees, Odes, Prayer of Manasseh, Letter of Baruch, Florence, Laurentian Library, or 58. This manuscript has a text more similar to the Masoretic text as 5b1 has, and scholars don't know if this is due to a more original text, or to later corrections. It includes all the books of the Hebrew Bible and Bel and the Dragon, Susanna, Judith, Prayer of Manasseh, Cambridge, University Library, UI, 1, 2. It is a 12th century manuscript that probably originated in Tarabdanaria, and was later moved to India and later to Cambridge by Claudius Buchanan in the early 19th century. It is the best testimony of an important textual family. It includes all the books of the Hebrew Bible and Wisdom, Letter of Jeremiah, Baruch, Bel and the Dragon, Susanna, Judith, Sirach, 1 Maccabees, 2 Maccabees, Tobit, 3 Maccabees, 4 Maccabees, 1 Esdras, Letter of Baruch, Baghdad, Library of Chaldean Patriarchate, 211. 12th century manuscript used often as base text for Psalms 152 to 155. Early print editions: Paris Polyglot, 1645, edited by Gabriel Schneider and probably based on manuscript 17a5. Considered today a recent and not reliable manuscript. London Polyglot, 1657. Based on the Paris Polyglot text with an appendix of some collations from other manuscripts kept in Oxford ranging from the 12th to the 17th century. Samuel Lee edition, first printed in London in 1823 by the British and Foreign Bible Society and reprinted in 1826. The text is almost like the London Polyglots one. In the 1826, the British and Foreign Bible Society decided to cut from each printed copy of this Bible the page containing the Psalm chapter 151 because this psalm is not in the Protestant canon. Urmia Bible, published in 1852 by Justin Perkins, that included also a parallel translation in the Urmian dialect of Assyrian Neo-Aramaic language. Mosul edition, published in 1888 to 1892 by Clement Joseph David and by Mar-Georges Ebed Ies Ukiyath for the Dominican Mission. This edition, differently from previously editions, includes also some books not in the Hebrew Bible, but found in many Peshitta manuscripts. These books included a Tobit, Judith, additions to Esther, Wisdom, Sirach, Letter of Jeremiah, Baruch, Bel and the Dragon, Susanna, 1 Maccabees, 2 Maccabees, 2 Baruch with the Letter of Baruch.